Welcome back to the Old Photo Vault channel. The Man Who Stayed for Coffee, Cedar Bluff, Arkansas. Summer 1932, the morning the photograph was taken. Earl Dawson stood barefoot on the porch, one foot resting on the Coca-Cola sign, waiting for the heat to lift. He had already brewed the coffee, set out the cups, and written the same promise on the chalkboard he wrote every day. "We roast coffee daily." Inside the store, the shelves were neat, the jars full, the air still. Later, when the picture was developed, people noticed the figure in the window to the left. A pale shape standing where no one remembered standing. Earl said it must have been the glass, or a trick of the light. Still, he began setting out an extra cup each morning. The coffee never cooled evenly after that. One cup always stayed warm, long after Earl closed the shop, as if someone was still there, waiting to be served. The bed that wasn't empty. St. Agnes Infirmary, Ohio. Winter, 1918. On the day the photograph was taken, the ward smelled of soap and boiled linen, and the nurses moved quietly between the beds, careful not to wake anyone who could still sleep. Clara Whitmore lay near the window, her hands folded the way her mother had taught her, listening to the rustle of skirts and the soft reading of names from a clipboard. When the picture was developed, someone noticed a narrow figure standing beside the medicine cabinet, pale against the wall, its head bent as if reading along. Clara's bed, however, was marked empty in the ledger that morning. She had died just before dawn, the sheet pulled up and smoothed away. After that winter, the nurses said one bed never stayed cold. Each night, the blankets settled slightly inward, as though Clara had returned to finish listening, still waiting for her name to be spoken. The home grocery never closed. Willow Creek, Pennsylvania. Autumn 1934. The day the photograph was taken, Mr. Harlan swept the porch leaves into a neat pile and straightened the sign that promised salad, a tea, and double cola. The windows were arranged with care, every tin facing outward, as if order itself might keep the store alive. When the picture was developed, people noticed a figure at the far left of the frame, pale and incomplete, standing where the porch steps met the ground. There was no head above the shoulders, only an empty blur where a face should have been. Mr. Harlan said it was a trick of motion, someone bending as they walked past. Yet no one remembered seeing a man without a hat, or hearing footsteps leave the porch. After that autumn, he stopped locking the door at night. Each morning, the leaves were swept again, and the bell inside rang once, low and patient, as if waiting to be seen. The space between the crosses. Normandy, France, summer, 1944. The photograph shows two young soldiers standing quietly among the graves, caps tilted forward, hands raised in an uncertain salute, as if unsure whether the moment requires formality or silence. The grass was newly cut that morning, the soil still loose and dark, each white cross placed with careful distance between the next. Neither man remembered anyone else standing there when the shutter clicked. Yet when the image was printed, a faint figure appeared between the nearest markers, thin as breath, its outline blurred and unfinished, as though the body had not decided how much of itself to remain. The soldiers said it must have been heat or dust rising from the ground. Later, one of them admitted the crosses felt closer than before, the spaces narrowing as he walked away. That night, he dreamed of standing still while something moved gently past him, careful not to disturb the rows, careful not to be named. The chair. She refused to leave. Hartford, Connecticut, 1869. The woman sat very straight for the photograph, hands folded, bonnet tied too tightly under her chin, as if posture itself might keep her presentable. Her name was Eliza Morton, and the chair belonged to her daughter, who had insisted she sit near the window for better light. The room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of a mantel clock just out of frame. When the plate was developed, The photographer noticed her face had shifted, softened in places, as though it had been pressed twice into the image. Eliza's daughter said her mother had grown tired toward the end, often pausing mid-sentence, listening for someone who never arrived. After the funeral, the chair was left where it was. Dust settled everywhere else, but the seat stayed clean, and sometimes, late in the afternoon, the clock slowed, as if waiting for her to finish sitting before time moved on. The customer above the shelves. Savannah, Georgia, spring 1906. The store was busiest just after noon, when the ceiling fans pushed warm air in slow circles and the smell of sugar and coffee settled into the wood. Mrs. Calder stood at the counter counting change, while her husband worked the register and nodded at familiar faces. Everything in the photograph looks orderly. The stacked tins, the glass cases, the careful posture of people who expected to be remembered clearly. Only later did someone notice the figure above the shelves, standing where the narrow stair led to storage. It appears half-formed, neither shadow nor light, watching the room without leaning on anything. Mr. Calder said no one was allowed upstairs during business hours. Still, he began locking the stairwell each morning. Customers complained that someone was always just out of sight, waiting patiently. At closing time, the upstairs light sometimes stayed on, though no footsteps ever came down. The stove that stayed warm. Dayton, Ohio, autumn 1957. Marion Keller paused in the kitchen doorway, while the pot came to a steady boil, one hand resting on the refrigerator handle the way she always did when someone was late. The house smelled of soap, onions, and the faint sweetness of canned peaches cooling on the counter. She had dressed carefully for the photograph, apron tied straight, hair pinned back, because her sister liked things to look orderly. When the slide was developed, there was a soft doubling along Marion's shoulder, a pale blur that didn't match the light in the room. Marion said it was nothing, just heat from the stove. After her death that winter, the burner beneath the pot was found warm more than once, though no one had turned it on. The refrigerator door sometimes stood ajar in the mornings. The kitchen kept waiting, quietly, as if dinner was only delayed, not canceled. The Heads That Learned to Watch. Newark, New Jersey. Winter, 1912. The factory floor was warm despite the snow outside, and the shelves were lined with faces waiting for their turn. Mr. Levin worked carefully, lifting one head at a time, fitting the eyes, checking the paint, humming to keep the hours from dragging. The photographer caught him mid-task, the doll's mouth open as if surprised by the attention. Nothing seemed wrong at first, just rows of identical expressions, neat as books. When the print came back, a few faces along the shelves appeared angled toward him, not the lens, their gazes slightly misaligned from the rest. Mr. Levin said it was coincidence, the trick of shadows and repetition. Still, he began finishing earlier each day. The heads nearest his bench seemed to change first, their smiles settling unevenly after he passed. On mornings he arrived late. The dust showed small disturbances, as though the watching had not stopped when the lights went out. The place she set for him. Bloomington, Indiana. Spring, 1963. The dining room was kept ready, even on weekdays. The lace tablecloth smoothed flat, and the candles set straight, but never lit. Helen Foster liked the quiet of the afternoon, the way the light came through the curtains and softened the cabinet glass. The photograph was meant to show the room before supper, nothing more than proof that the house was still orderly. Later, when the slide was examined, a thin white shape appeared beside the window, faint as breath on glass, standing where a chair might have been pulled back. Helen said it was sunlight or dust caught mid-air. Still, she began setting one extra place at the table, just in case. The chairs sometimes shifted slightly overnight. The door remained locked. In the mornings, the tablecloth was never wrinkled, only gently disturbed, as though someone had stood there patiently, waiting to be invited to sit. The paper that remembered names. New Orleans, Louisiana, 1891. The paper was found folded inside a kitchen drawer, pressed flat beneath twine and a rusted spoon, its edges darkened by oil and years. It looked harmless enough. Thin as onion skin, covered in ink shapes no one could read anymore. Crosses, looping marks, and figures that suggested bodies without faces. Mrs. Delacroix said it had belonged to her grandmother, kept only because throwing it away felt impolite. When the photograph was taken, the paper showed something new. Two pale forms near the top, faintly human, standing too close together to be decoration. After that, the drawer would not stay shut. At night, the paper softened, as if breathed on. Mrs. Delacroix dreamed of voices reciting names she did not know, pausing where hers should have been. In the morning, the ink looked darker. The paper lay unfolded, patient, as though it had finally remembered who was still living nearby. The change that was never given. Cedar Falls, Iowa. Late winter 1974. The photograph was taken just before closing, when the fluorescent lights hummed and the smell of tobacco clung to the aisles. Mark Jensen stood behind the counter in his apron, hand resting where customers always placed their coins, trying to look older than he felt. Mrs. Adler worked the register beside him, her back slightly turned, counting slowly as she had for years. Everything looked ordinary. The stacked cigarette cartons, the neat shelves, the quiet trust of a familiar store. Only later did Mark notice her face in the photo. Blurred, pale, almost transparent, as if she were already fading while still standing there. He remembered that night clearly. Mrs. Adler had paused mid-transaction, staring at the register as though it no longer recognized her. She died the following spring. After that, customers swore someone stood behind the counter when Mark worked alone, correcting totals under their breath. The register rang open by itself. The change inside was always exact, except for one missing coin, warm to the touch, as if it had just been passed from a hand that refused to leave. The channel that wouldn't turn off. Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Summer 1978. The photograph shows Linda Morales sitting cross-legged on the carpet, the television dark behind her, the room warm with late-day light and the faint smell of dust and old fabric. She had been watching cartoons earlier, the volume low so her parents wouldn't complain, and she remembered turning the set off herself. In the picture, everything looked settled. The magazines on the floor, the hum of the air conditioner, the calm way she holds her hands. It was only later that her mother noticed the face in the wood paneling beside the television, small and pale, pressed forward as if listening. Linda said she never saw it. After that summer, the television sometimes clicked on by itself, glowing softly with no picture, no sound. Linda would wake at night to the feeling of being watched. In the morning, the screen was warm, reflecting nothing at all, as if whatever had been there was still sitting quietly, waiting for the program to resume. The Man in the Back Seat. Kampong Sungai Raya, Malaya, 1947. They stopped on the dirt road to rest the engine and stretch their legs, leaning against the truck the way men do when they want the moment to look easy. Someone joked about the heat, someone else about the long drive ahead. And the camera came out briefly, as if to prove they had been there together. The forest stood very still behind them, all trunks and shade, the road pale and empty in both directions. When the photograph was printed, a sixth figure appeared behind the windshield, seated upright in the back, his face dimmed by reflection, his cap pulled low. None of the men remembered anyone riding inside. They said the truck had been empty all morning, still. The driver admitted later that the engine felt heavier after that stop, as though it were carrying more than it should. On the road afterward, no one chose the back seat. They said it stayed warm long after the truck was parked, as if someone had just stood up and stepped quietly into the trees. The empty seat beside her. Somewhere over the Atlantic, autumn 1961. The photograph was taken midway through the flight, when the cabin lights were dimmed and the engines settled into their long, patient hum. Ruth Calder smiled politely, holding her drink the way the stewardess had suggested, knees angled toward the empty seat beside her. She had dressed carefully for the trip, hat pinned just so, because flying still felt ceremonial then. Outside the window, the clouds lay thick and unmoving, like a second ceiling. When the slide was developed, a faint shadow appeared in the seat next to hers, pressed into the fabric as though someone had just stood up. Ruth insisted she had traveled alone, yet she remembered turning once, mid-flight, to apologize for taking the armrest, certain someone was there. After that journey, she avoided window seats. She said the quiet at cruising altitude felt crowded, and sometimes, when the plane banked gently, she felt a warmth beside her, steady and patient, waiting for the drink she never finished. The catch that counted wrong. Bayou Lafourche, Louisiana. Summer 1910. They lined up on the dock with their baskets full, boots wet, shirts stiff with salt, waiting for the photograph to be taken before the fish were hauled away. The morning had gone well, nets heavy, the river calm in a way that made men careless. Someone joked that the count was short by one, and another said it only felt that way because the baskets were packed too tight. When the image was developed, a pale shape appeared low between the tubs, thin as mist rising off the planks, bent slightly forward as if lifting something that wasn't there. No one remembered a man standing there, and the head count still came out even. After that summer, the fishermen said the catch always felt heavier than it should. One basket was never opened. It stayed damp longer than the rest, as though something inside it was still waiting to be carried back to shore. The silence between the prayers. Veliki Novgorod, Russia. Winter 1903. The photograph was taken inside the church just after Vespers, when the last candles were burning low and the cold had begun to creep back through the stone. The crucifix stood above the iconostasis, familiar and unmoving. Its shadow stretched unevenly across the carved doors. No one remembered the room feeling strange that evening. The faithful had crossed themselves, kissed the icons, and gone home quietly, leaving the church to its echoes. When the plate was developed, a darkness appeared that had not been there before, folding inward around the cross as though the light itself had withdrawn. The figure of Christ seemed slightly altered, the head lowered more than the carving allowed, the body elongated by something other than shadow. The caretaker said it was age, dust on the lens, nothing worth fearing. After that winter, prayers spoken beneath the crucifix felt unfinished. Candles burned down unevenly. Some swore that, when the church was empty, the silence pressed back, heavy, attentive, waiting for the sound of footsteps that never came. The space they left, Bonaventure Cemetery, Savannah, Georgia. Late afternoon, 1898. The stones stood in a careful row beneath the live oaks, their names softened by moss and years of rain. Families had once visited together, brushing leaves aside, reading aloud what time had not yet erased. The photograph was taken during a quiet hour, when even the birds seemed to pause, and nothing moved except the hanging Spanish moss. Later, when the image was examined, a pale vertical shape appeared between two headstones, faint and unfinished, like a figure caught mid-step and then reconsidered. No marker bore its name. Groundskeepers said it was light slipping through the trees, nothing more. Still, visitors noticed that the space between those graves felt occupied, subtly narrowed, as though something stood there politely, unwilling to intrude. Leaves never settled fully in that gap. Rain darkened the surrounding earth, but that strip stayed dry, waiting as if someone expected to be acknowledged before lying down again. The second exposure. London, England, 1896. The young man sat straight for the portrait, jacket brushed, tie knotted too tightly, eyes fixed on the lens as he had been instructed. His name was Thomas Hale, a clerk newly arrived in the city, eager to send proof of himself back home. The studio smelled of dust and chemicals, and the photographer told him not to move, not even to breathe deeply. When the plate was developed, Thomas's face came out sharp and composed, exactly as expected. Only later did the photographer notice the figure behind him, faint and unfinished, standing just over his right shoulder, its features blurred as if still deciding how to appear. No one else had been in the room. Thomas laughed when told, blaming reflections or a second exposure. Yet, he never ordered another print. Years later, the negative was found again. The figure behind him had darkened slightly, while Thomas's face had begun to fade, as though one of them had stayed, and the other was slowly learning how to leave. If these old photographs made you feel like someone was quietly standing just out of frame, you're not alone. Time doesn't always erase a moment. It sometimes leaves it watching. If you saw something you can't explain, tell me in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the places where the past refuses to stay still, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next image. Because some stories only appear after the picture fades.